Imagine a world where angels and demons are constantly at war, and you're right in the middle of it. This wasn't just a wild fantasy for John Calvin, the 16th century reformer. For him, the spiritual battle was as real as the air we breathe, and it was happening all around us all the time. Calvin didn't spend much time on the details that didn't matter to him. He wasn't interested in when angels were created or how many ranks they had. He thought those questions were just a waste of time. Instead, he focused on what the Bible said about angels and what it meant for the lives of believers. Calvin believed that angels were created by God, just like everything else in the universe. They were good when they were first made, but some of them rebelled against God and became demons. The ones who stayed loyal to God are now His helpers, working tirelessly to protect and guide the faithful. One of Calvin's biggest peeves was the idea of guardian angels. He thought it was silly to believe that each person had their own personal angel watching over them. Instead, he believed that God sends whole armies of angels to protect the church and its members. These angels are like a divine security force, always ready to defend the faithful against the threats of the devil and his minions. But Calvin was also very careful about how people thought about angels. He didn't want anyone to start worshiping them or treating them like gods. He reminded everyone that angels are just creatures like us, and they exist to serve God, not to be served themselves. They have no power of their own and can only act when God tells them to. Calvin saw the world as a battlefield, with God and his angels on one side and Satan and his demons on the other. He believed that every day the forces of good and evil are clashing, and the fate of the world is at stake. But he also believed that God is in control, and no matter how fierce the battle, God's victory is already certain. In Calvin's view, the angels are God's secret weapons, invisible but always present. They move through the world, carrying out God's will and protecting His people. They are the unseen guardians who watch over us, guiding us through the dangers of life and keeping us safe from the forces of darkness. For Calvin, the spiritual battle was not just a story from the past. It was a living reality, and every believer was a soldier in this cosmic war. The angels were our allies, and with God's help, we could stand firm against the enemy. But we had to be vigilant, because the devil was always looking for ways to attack and destroy us. Calvin's teachings about angels were both reassuring and terrifying. They reminded his followers that they were never alone, but they also warned them that the battle was far from over. The angels were on their side, but the fight was real, and the stakes were high. So, as you walk through your day, remember that the angels are watching over you. They are the unseen guardians, the celestial soldiers, fighting for your soul. And in the end, it's not just about you. It's about the eternal struggle between good and evil, a battle that has been raging since the beginning of time. Calvin had a lot to say about angels, and his thoughts on them were quite different from what many people believed at the time. For Calvin, angels were creatures just like humans, and they were subject to God's authority. He was very careful not to elevate angels too much, because he thought that doing so could lead to idolatry, worshiping something other than God. Calvin believed that Christ was superior to all angels. He often referred to passages in the Bible, like Hebrews chapter 1, verse 13-14, to support this idea. According to Calvin, Christ is the head of the angelic creation, and angels are there to serve God's plan. In his commentaries on Colossians chapter 1 verse 20 and Ephesians chapter 1 verse 10, Calvin emphasized that even the angels needed Christ's grace to remain in God's favor. Without Christ, they would be at risk of falling or rebelling, just like humans. Calvin also had a unique take on Job chapter 4, verse 18, where it says, "In his angels he found blemish." Most people thought this verse was talking about the fallen angels, but Calvin argued that it applied to the good angels as well. He believed that even the good angels are not perfect in God's eyes and need Christ's grace to stay in harmony with God. This idea showed Calvin's commitment to keeping angels in their proper place as created beings, not as divine or semi-divine entities. Calvin was also careful to limit the knowledge and power of angels. He believed that angels, like humans, only know things in part and are not omniscient. For Calvin, this was important because it prevented people from attributing too much importance to angels. He argued that the angels themselves were curious about the future and the plan of salvation, just like humans. They didn't understand everything, and they needed Christ's grace just as much as humans do. One of Calvin's most significant points was that angels are not mediators between God and humans. He strongly opposed the idea that people should pray to or invoke angels for help. Instead, he insisted that Christ is the only mediator, and that he alone connects heaven and earth. Calvin saw this as a way to protect the glory of God and prevent people from turning their devotion to created beings like angels. Calvin's views on angels were shaped by his broader theological concerns. He wanted to emphasize God's sovereignty and the need for Christ's mediation. By limiting the power and importance of angels, Calvin aimed to keep the focus on God and Christ. This approach was part of his larger effort to combat what he saw as idolatrous practices and to ensure that people understood the true nature of God's relationship with the world. When it came to human nature, Calvin's views were equally nuanced. He often discussed the concept of the imago Dei, or the image of God, which refers to the idea that humans are made in God's image. This concept was a source of much debate among theologians, and Calvin's take on it was influenced by earlier thinkers like Irenaeus and Augustine. Irenaeus had argued that while the likeness of God, similitudo, was lost in the fall, the image of God, imago, remained. For Irenaeus, the image of God included rationality and free will, which are fundamental to being human. These qualities, he believed, could not be destroyed by sin. Augustine, on the other hand, saw the image of God in the Trinitarian structure of the human soul, specifically in the memory, understanding, and love. He argued that these functions could only fully reflect God when the soul also knew and loved God. For Augustine, the image of God was closely tied to the relationship between the soul and God. Calvin agreed with the idea that the image of God includes rationality and free will, but he also emphasized the relational aspect. He believed that while humans retained some aspects of the image of God after the fall, such as reason and the capacity for knowledge, the full image was lost because of the rupture in the relationship with God. For Calvin, the fall meant that humans no longer had the right spiritual attitude or the ability to reflect and mirror God's nature. Calvin's views on the imago Dei were also shaped by his polemical context. He often engaged with the debates of his time, such as the discussions about the immortality of the soul and free will. He rejected the Averroist idea that the soul was not immortal and instead affirmed the traditional Christian belief in the soul's immortality. This belief was crucial for Calvin's understanding of the human condition and the need for salvation through Christ. In his discussions of human nature, Calvin was always careful to balance the natural endowments of humans with the need for divine grace. He believed that while humans have the capacity for reason and knowledge, These capacities are marred by sin and need to be restored through Christ. For Calvin, the image of God in humans is a reminder of both the dignity and the fallen state of humanity, and it points to the hope of restoration through faith in Christ. The battle over the soul's immortality was a fierce one, spanning centuries and involving some of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. At the heart of this debate were the ideas of radical Aristotelianism, which argued that the human soul was not immortal and could not exist without the body. Saint Bonaventure and Saint Thomas Aquinas were two of the most prominent figures who opposed these radical views. In December 1270, Aquinas wrote a treatise called De Unitate Intellectus, on the unity of the intellect, to refute the teachings of Siger of Brabant, a prominent radical Aristotelian. Bonaventure also opposed these teachings in his works Collationes de Decim Preceptus, Conferences on the Ten Commandments, and Collationes de Septem Donis Spiritus Sancti, Conferences on the Seven Gifts of the Holy Spirit. The Parisian condemnations of 1270 were a significant moment in this battle. They condemned several propositions that aligned with radical Aristotelianism, such as the idea that the intellect of all men is one and the same, and that the soul corrupts when the body dies. However, the condemnations did not stop the spread of radical Aristotelianism. In 1277, the arts faculty at the University of Paris was still defending these views, and Pope John XXI had to issue a warning against them. Stephen Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, issued another condemnation in 1277, this time of 219 propositions, including the idea that the soul is not immortal. The controversy over immortality continued into the 14th century. Pope John XXII sparked a new debate when he denied that souls could see God, the beatific vision, before the Last Judgment. This view was strongly opposed by the masters at the University of Paris, and in 1336, Pope Benedict XII condemned the belief that the soul must sleep until the Last Judgment. The debate didn't end there. During the Renaissance, thinkers like Pietro Pomponazzi of Mantua challenged the orthodox view of the soul's immortality. Pomponazzi argued that the human soul is a material form, midway between the angels and animals. He believed that the human intellect functions at an intermediate level, sharing both material and immaterial qualities. According to Pomponazzi, the soul is unqualifiedly mortal and relatively immortal. While it can grasp universals and participate in a form of immortality, it is fundamentally tied to the body and cannot exist without it. Pomponazzi's ideas were not just philosophical. They had religious implications. He insisted that his arguments were based on human reason and that the immortality of the soul should be a matter of faith, not philosophy. However, his views were considered heretical, and in 1513, Pope Leo X condemned all mortalist heresies at the Fifth Lateran Council. The debate over the soul's immortality also influenced the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin, a key figure in the Reformation, wrote extensively on the nature of the soul. In his Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin argued that the human soul is a real, substantial entity that is immortal. He distinguished between two groups of opponents: those who believed the soul sleeps until the resurrection, and those who thought the soul is merely a vital power that perishes with the body. Calvin maintained that the soul, as the image of God, is eternal and continues to exist in a conscious state after death, awaiting the resurrection. Calvin's arguments were not just academic. They had practical implications for his understanding of human nature and salvation. He believed that the soul, separated from the body, enjoys a state of peace and joy in the presence of God. This view was in direct opposition to the ideas of the Anabaptists and other radicals who held that the soul either sleeps or perishes until the Last Judgment. The debates over the soul's immortality continued throughout the 16th century, influenced by the translations and publications of Aristotle's works and the commentaries of Averroes. Other thinkers like François Rabelais and Etienne Dolet also contributed to the discussion, often challenging traditional views and facing charges of heresy. In the end, the nature of the soul and its immortality remained a central issue in theology and philosophy, reflecting the deep questions humans have about life, death, and the afterlife. Calvin had a lot to say about the soul and its nature, both before and after the fall of Adam. He believed that the soul is immortal and created directly by God, not something that comes from our bodies. This idea was important to him because he thought it proved that humans are special, different from animals, and made in God's image. Calvin thought that before the fall, the soul was perfect. Adam had a clear understanding of right and wrong, and his will was free to choose the good. His senses, reason, and will all worked together in harmony, making him capable of knowing and loving God. Calvin believed that Adam could see God's glory in the world around him, like in the beauty of nature, and this helped him to live a life of obedience and praise to God. But when Adam sinned, everything changed. The soul's order was disrupted, and it became corrupted. Calvin argued that while the mind and will are still active, they are now bound to sin. The mind, though still capable of understanding and judging, is weakened and often misleads us. The will, which was once free to choose the good, now only desires evil. This doesn't mean that humans became like animals. They still have a spark of the divine image, but it's damaged. Calvin saw the activity of the fallen mind in the way people create idols. Instead of seeing God in nature, people create false gods and worship them. This is because the mind, though still seeking God, is confused and can't find the truth. The will, too, is always active, but it's always choosing sin. Calvin believed that the will became so enslaved to sin that it can't choose the good on its own. This is why, according to Calvin, God's grace is necessary for salvation. Calvin also talked about the natural law, which is the basic understanding of right and wrong that everyone has. Even after the fall, people can still recognize what is just and unjust. This means that people can't claim they sin out of ignorance. They know what's right, but they choose to do wrong. This is why Calvin believed that sin is a choice, even if the will is corrupted. Despite the fall, Calvin thought that human nature still has some good qualities. People can still reason, remember, and invent things, which he saw as signs of the divine in us. However, these abilities are marred by sin, and they can't lead us to God on their own. Calvin believed that only through God's grace can the soul be restored, and the image of God in us be renewed. Calvin's view of the soul and the fall was deeply rooted in his understanding of God's sovereignty and the need for divine grace. He saw the fall as a complete disruption of the soul's original order, but he also believed that even in our fallen state, there are still glimmers of the divine image that can be restored through faith in Christ. In his book, De Spiritu et Litera, Augustine explored the nature of the human will and how it is affected by original sin. Augustine believed that when a person is born, they carry with them the burden of original sin, which disrupts their will and confuses their desires. This sin makes it so that people are naturally inclined to do wrong, even though they might not want to. However, Augustine also argued that even when a person does something they don't want to do, they still do it by their own will. For example, if someone is forced to do something they dislike, they are still acting by their will, even if it's not a free or happy will. This is because the will is always active, even when it is enslaved by sin. Augustine saw this active nature of the will as a crucial point. He believed that true freedom isn't just about being able to choose. It's about being unable to choose evil. For Augustine, true freedom means having a will that is firmly rooted in goodness and cannot be swayed to do wrong. This kind of freedom is a gift from God, and it's something that humans cannot achieve on their own. Luther, a later theologian, also drew on Augustine's ideas. Luther argued that even though the human will is corrupted by sin, it is still always active. Luther's opponent, Erasmus, believed that if the will is totally fallen, it must be passive. But Luther insisted that even a fallen will is not passive. It is always choosing, even if those choices are always in the direction of sin. Luther believed that God and human beings are always active, and that God uses even fallen humans as instruments to carry out his will. Calvin, another important theologian, continued this tradition. Calvin agreed with Augustine and Luther that the fallen will is always active, even if it is enslaved to sin. Calvin used the distinction between necessity and compulsion to explain this. Necessity is the inner state of the soul that determines its choices, while compulsion is an external force that forces someone to do something against their will. According to Calvin, people sin because of the inner necessity of their fallen will, not because they are forced by an external power. This means that even though people are deeply corrupted by sin, they are still responsible for their actions because they are choosing to sin, even if they can only choose evil. Calvin also believed that even though human nature is totally corrupted in God's sight, people still retain some of their original human qualities. For example, he believed that humans remain the most important part of creation, and that the world still serves them. He often referred to the idea that humans are a microcosm, meaning that they contain a little world within themselves reflecting God's power, goodness, and wisdom. Even though sin has damaged human nature, it hasn't turned humans into beasts. Calvin saw this as a reason for wonder and gratitude, because it means that human society can still function and that people can still seek knowledge and create things. Calvin also believed that the remnants of the image of God in humans, things like reason, will, and conscience, play a crucial role in human society. These remnants are why humans can still form laws, create art and science, and live together in communities. Even though these remnants do not make people good or save them from sin, they do explain why human society hasn't fallen into complete chaos. Calvin saw the survival of these human qualities as a sign of God's ongoing presence in the world, even in a fallen state. Calvin's ideas about human nature were shaped by his debates with other thinkers and by the context of his time. He often emphasized different aspects of the image of God depending on who he was arguing with. For example, when he was arguing against those who thought the soul died with the body, he emphasized the immortality of the soul as part of the image of God. When he was arguing against those who thought human nature was not totally corrupted, he emphasized the total depravity of the human soul. But in all these contexts, Calvin always maintained that humans remain active, rational beings who are responsible for their actions. Calvin's understanding of the remnants of the image of God also helped him explain the role of natural law in society. Natural law is a set of moral principles that are believed to be inherent in human nature and can be discovered through reason. Calvin saw natural law as a way that God's truth is still accessible to all people, even those who don't know God. This natural law is why people can still create just laws and live together in communities, even though they are fallen and sinful. Calvin believed that the remnants of the image of God and the principles of natural law work together to keep human society from falling apart completely. In the end, Calvin's view of human nature and the remnants of the image of God is a complex and nuanced one. It recognizes the deep corruption of human nature while also acknowledging the continuing human qualities that make society possible. This view has had a lasting impact on Christian theology and continues to shape how we think about the relationship between God, humanity, and the world. Isidore of Seville, a wise man from the 7th century, had some important ideas about laws. He took the old ideas of a Roman named Ulpian and made them his own. Isidore believed that jus naturae comes from nature itself. It's not something people made up. It's just the way things are. For example, he thought that it's natural for people to want to get married, have children, and take care of them. He also believed that everyone should have the same basic rights and freedoms. Isidore also talked about the difference between laws that come from God and laws that come from people. He said that all laws are either divine, from God, or human, made by people. Divine laws are based on nature, while human laws are based on what people have agreed to over time. Different groups of people might have different human laws because they have different traditions and customs. A few centuries later, a man named Gratian wrote a book called the Decretum Gratiani. This book became very important for understanding natural law during the Middle Ages. Gratian agreed with Isidore about the 3 types of laws: jus naturae, jus gentium, and jus civile. But he added that natural law is really about what it means to be human. He said that natural law is like a rule that's written in the Bible and the teachings of Jesus. One of the most important rules of natural law, according to Gratian, is the Golden Rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Gratian also said that natural law is more important than any other law. If a human law goes against natural law, it's not a real law at all. Natural law is always true and never changes. Then, in the 13th century, a very smart man named Thomas Aquinas wrote a lot about natural law in his book called the Summa Theologiae. Thomas said that law in general is a way to guide and measure how people should act. He explained that natural law is a part of how God's plan works in the world. God created the universe with a plan, and natural law is how humans participate in that plan. Thomas also said that natural law is the same for everyone in its basic principles. But when you look at the details, different people might have different ideas about what's right and wrong. He believed that if a human law goes against natural law, it's not a real law. In the late Middle Ages, some thinkers argued about whether natural law comes from God's will or God's reason. Some said that natural law is a rule that even God can't change, while others said that natural law is whatever God decides. Thomas Aquinas had a middle ground. He said that natural law is a rule that comes from God's nature and is always true, but God's will is what makes it binding. During the Reformation, a man named John Calvin wrote about natural law too. Calvin said that natural law is something that God has placed in everyone's heart, even people who don't know the Bible. He believed that natural law is why people can tell the difference between right and wrong, even if they haven't read the 10 Commandments. Calvin also said that the written laws in the Bible, like the 10 Commandments, help people understand natural law better because sin has made it harder for people to see the truth on their own. Calvin thought that natural law is important for society because it helps people live together in peace. He believed that God's providence, God's care for the world, is what keeps society from falling apart, even though people are sinful. Calvin saw natural law as a way that God continues to guide and protect the world, even after the fall, when humans first sinned. So for Calvin, natural law was not just a set of rules, but a way to explain how God keeps the world and society running smoothly, even when things seem chaotic. He believed that God's care and the natural laws He created are what help people live together and maintain order in the world. God, despite the damage caused by sin, still found joy in His creation. John Calvin, a key figure in the Protestant Reformation, explained that even after the fall, God continued to support the world through His power, wisdom, and goodness. The sun still rose and set, the seasons changed, and animals still found food. This ongoing order in nature was a sign of God's ongoing care and providence, even in a world marred by sin. For Calvin, sin did not completely destroy God's original plan. Instead, God's purposes remained unchanged, and He continued to maintain the natural order. The sun, stars, and seasons still functioned as they were designed, providing a stable environment for life to continue. The instinct of animals to find food and the regular cycles of planting and harvest were proof of God's ongoing presence and care. Calvin believed that nature was created to serve humans, who were the pinnacle of God's creation. Unlike some thinkers, Calvin didn't worry about the literal 6 days of creation. He saw the order in the creation story as a way to show that God prepared the world for Adam's arrival. God first set the sun and stars to benefit humans, filled the earth with living creatures, and provided food before creating Adam. This order reflected God's fatherly care and attention to detail. After the fall, the natural order continued to reflect God's glory and provide for human needs. Even though the world was tainted by sin, God's image in humans remained, though damaged. Calvin argued that this remnant of the divine image was why God continued to protect and preserve human life. He compared this to a worker loving his creation because it bore the marks of his labor. God, seeing His image in humans, continued to care for them. Calvin also believed that God's love for His image in humans was why He maintained the natural and social order. He used the concept of the imago Dei, image of God, to explain why God didn't abandon the human race. Even the wicked were sustained by God's providence, not because of their worthiness, but because of God's immutable decree that the earth should be inhabited by humans. This is why kingdoms and empires, even among non-believers, continued to exist. God's plan for the earth to be inhabited by humans remained unchanged. Calvin saw this as evidence of common grace, where God's goodness extends to all people, regardless of their faith. Psalm chapter 145, verse 9, which says, "The Lord is good to all," demonstrated to Calvin that God's merciful nature continued to benefit both the righteous and the wicked. Even those who didn't acknowledge God's fatherly character still benefited from the natural order and societal structures. However, the fall introduced disorder into the world, and this required God to impose restraints to maintain order. Calvin noted that after Adam's rebellion, animals also became more aggressive. God, in His providence, placed a secret bridle on the animals to prevent them from overwhelming humans. This bridle was a fear and dread of humans, ensuring that animals remained at a distance and could be domesticated. This restraint was a way for God to preserve a space for human society to exist. Similarly, God placed a mark of fear and dread in people to maintain order and ensure they obeyed their rulers. Calvin saw this as a parallel to the fear God implanted in animals. Just as animals feared humans, humans were made to fear and respect their leaders. This was necessary for the survival of human society, as it prevented chaos and ensured that people could live together in a structured and orderly way. Calvin's view of government was that it was a divinely ordained institution to maintain order and restrain the wickedness of humans. He didn't see the state as a result of the fall, but rather as a necessary part of God's plan for human society. Calvin defended the authority of magistrates and rulers, arguing that God had given them the power to govern. He saw the state as a bridle for sin, preventing the wicked from overwhelming the good and maintaining a space for ordered life. Calvin's perspective on the state was shaped by his opposition to the Anabaptists, who rejected the idea of Christians participating in government. Calvin believed that the Anabaptists were enemies of all order because they saw the state as incompatible with Christian living. While the Anabaptists acknowledged that government was necessary for the non-Christian world, they believed that Christians should separate themselves from it. Calvin, however, saw the need for Christians to engage with the world and participate in the structures of society. Despite the imperfections of the world and the church, Calvin emphasized the importance of Christian realism. He believed that Christians should recognize the sinfulness of the world and their own imperfections. The church, he argued, was not a perfect institution, but a community that was growing and moving toward perfection. This meant that Christians had a responsibility to engage with the world, distinguishing between the spiritual and civil realms and working to bring order and justice to society. Calvin's views on creation, the role of humans, and the function of government were rooted in his belief in God's providential care and the ongoing presence of the divine image in humans. Even in a fallen world, God's love and wisdom continued to sustain and guide creation, ensuring that life could go on and that human society could thrive. As we journey through the teachings of John Calvin, we find a world where the effects of sin and the need for order are deeply intertwined. Calvin believed that the world, though fallen, is still held together by God's providence. This means that even though things aren't perfect, God is still in control, and there are still ways for people to live together in a society that functions. Calvin saw the Anabaptists, a group of religious radicals, as a threat because they believed that true Christians could live without the need for government or laws. They thought that spiritual freedom meant they could ignore the rules of the world, but Calvin strongly disagreed. He argued that just because a person's conscience is free in God's sight, it doesn't mean they can ignore the laws of the land or the need for order in society. He believed that the spiritual freedom of Christians doesn't separate them from the world. Instead, it means they have a special responsibility to live within it and help maintain order. Calvin was very concerned about anarchy and chaos. He believed that without a clear structure and authority, society would fall apart. He thought that people are naturally selfish and prone to conflict, and that without rules and leaders they would just fight and struggle. This idea comes from his understanding of the fall, the moment when humans first sinned and turned away from God. After the fall, people became greedy and ambitious, and they no longer naturally respected each other or followed rules. Calvin believed that God set up governments and laws to help keep people in check and to prevent complete chaos. But Calvin also believed that humans still have a natural sense of order and justice. He thought that, even though people are sinful, they still have the ability to recognize what's right and wrong. This ability comes from what he called natural law, which is a set of principles that God has placed in everyone's conscience. These principles help people understand the importance of things like family, property, and social order. For example, Calvin believed that the natural instinct to care for others and form communities is part of this natural law. He also thought that the natural horror people feel toward things like murder and incest is a sign that they know these acts are wrong. Calvin often referred to the wisdom of ancient philosophers like Plato, Seneca, and Cicero to support his ideas. These thinkers understood the importance of laws and good government, even though they didn't know about God in the Christian sense. Calvin believed that the natural principles of justice and equity are universal and can be recognized by everyone, whether they are Christians or not. One of the key principles Calvin emphasized was the importance of property and boundaries. He believed that God has given each person and each nation their own land and possessions, and it's important to respect these boundaries. He argued that if everyone tried to share everything, it would lead to confusion and conflict. This is why he supported the idea of private property and the need for clear laws to protect it. In the end, Calvin's teachings about society and government reflect a deep belief in the need for order and structure. He saw the world as a place where sin and disorder are always present, but where God's providence and the natural law help to keep things from falling apart. For Calvin, true freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about living in a way that respects God's order and helps maintain a society where everyone can live together in peace.